The night she landed in Cape Town, she thought she was meeting a gentle 25-year-old man who adored her. Instead, she walked into the life of a stranger twice his claimed age, someone whose strength, secrets, and shadows would haunt her nights. What happened inside that house? And why did the truth only come out when his body was carried away? Her journey began with love and ended in a courtroom built on lies. The journey began long before the plane touched the runway, long before the wheels hissed against the Cape Town airstrip, and her heart tried to match the steady hum of the engine. For most of the 14-hour flight, she sat rigid against the window, watching the world fold beneath clouds while rehearsing the versions of him she hoped were real. She told herself she wasn't traveling for a dream. She was traveling for a person, someone who promised safety, softness, and the kind of affection she thought she had been missing. But the excitement that pushed her onto the plane didn't survive the whole flight. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a quiet unease settled into her, shaped by the memory of his too careful words, the way he always avoided video calls, the way he called himself 25 with a laugh that sounded older. She tried brushing the thoughts away, but they returned like weak static at the back of her mind. Cape Town appeared below her like a vast, glittering coastline, a place that should have welcomed her. Instead, she felt the distance tighten around her, as if sinking her into a life she didn't yet understand. The voice of the pilot broke the silence, but she barely heard him. Her breathing had grown light, her fingertips cold. When she stepped off the plane, warm air met her skin, but it didn't comfort her. The terminal buzzed with life. Travelers rushing, families reuniting, luggage wheels dragging across polished floors. She scanned the crowd, searching for the man she had crafted from messages and promises. She held her phone tightly, scrolling up through his chats again. Can't wait to hold you. You'll feel safe with me. Trust me, Angel. But trust, she realized, was the first thing that felt heavy. Her eyes drifted across the arrival hall until she saw someone lift a hand. A tall, muscular figure stepped out from the crowd. For a moment she froze. He wasn't the soft-featured, youthful version she had pictured. His arms were thicker, his posture firmer, his presence heavier. His smile was confident, almost rehearsed. He walked toward her with steady steps. "Welcome to Cape Town," he said, his voice deep, calm, practiced. She wiped her palms against her jeans before forcing a smile. "Hi, I'm glad you're here." He leaned in to take her luggage, his fingers brushing her wrist, and she felt the strength in his grip more than she expected, more than his age suggested. For a second her instincts whispered something she couldn't name, but she swallowed the feeling and followed him toward the exit. The doors opened into a warm breeze. Cars honked. Taxis circled. The sun dipped lower into the skyline. He walked slightly ahead of her, pulling her suitcase as though he already understood the rhythm of her steps. She couldn't decide if it was comforting or intrusive. The drive into the city stretched long. She watched the coastline blur past while her thoughts unraveled in quiet threads. He spoke lightly about the weather, the beaches, the food, topics too neat, too practiced. "You seem nervous," he said suddenly. Her heartbeat jumped. "It's just new, all of this." "It'll feel right soon," he replied. "Give it time." His tone was gentle, yet something underneath it pressed too firmly against her senses. The sky darkened as the roads narrowed and the neighborhood shifted from busy intersections to quieter streets lined with distant hills. She noticed how few people walked the sidewalks. She noticed how far apart the houses stood. She noticed the soft way he kept glancing at her reflection in the window. "You like where we're going," he said without looking at her. "Is it far from the city?" she asked. "Far enough," he answered. "Quiet, private." The word private echoed longer than it should have. When the car turned onto a dim road she had never heard him mention, her fingers tightened around her bag strap. The headlights carved out fragments of unfamiliar houses, the shadows between them stretching like unspoken warnings. She leaned slightly toward the window, as if searching for reassurance in the night. But reassurance didn't come. Instead, a single thought settled inside her. Something about this place feels planned. And though she couldn't explain why, the air in the car grew heavy with a silence that promised something was waiting ahead, something he had not told her, something buried beneath his calm smile. She followed him out of the car, the uneven streetlights casting shadows across the narrow driveway. His presence was immediate, filling the space around her with a weight she could almost touch. He moved with careful precision, every gesture measured, every step deliberate. She tried to smile, telling herself it was just nerves, that the distance, the travel, the strange city, all of it, was enough to make her senses feel distorted. "Welcome home," he said, holding the door open for her. His voice was calm, confident, and smooth, but there was an edge she couldn't place. She noticed how the muscles in his arms flexed as he shifted the weight of her luggage, the contrast between strength and control making her stomach twist in unease. The house smelled faintly of sandalwood and polished wood, faint enough to be comforting, yet sharp enough to hint at an intention behind the careful cleanliness. She noticed the way the furniture was arranged, almost perfectly symmetrical, as if he had rehearsed her path through the rooms. Each corner seemed to watch, each hallway a silent observer. "You'll get used to it," he said, turning to meet her gaze. "It's simple but private." Her mind caught on the word again. Private. Not welcoming, not warm, but private. She tried to mask her tightening chest with a nod. "It's nice," she murmured. He smiled, a practiced smile, and she felt the odd flutter of both relief and doubt. "You look tired," he added. "Traveling from Chicago can be exhausting." "I am," she admitted, "but I'm happy to be here." He stepped closer, a hand brushing against her shoulder in a gesture that was polite yet firm. She could feel the heat of him, the certainty, the dominance that radiated from his every movement. She realized, with a sudden jolt, that he was not the soft-spoken young man she had imagined from the online chats. There was something older about him, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. She wanted to ask his age again, wanted to hear the familiar number he had typed in messages, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she followed him to the open-plan living area, noticing how each photograph on the wall seemed curated to suggest warmth, normalcy, yet each smile froze in time, too perfect, too deliberate. As he poured a glass of water for her, she caught a glimpse of his hands, strong, veined, and slightly scarred. She wondered how much he had left unspoken. What stories had behind the quiet control? He handed her the glass with a casual, almost intimate ease, and she felt a flicker of doubt. Did he notice her hesitation? Did he already know how easily she could be unsettled? The evening passed with small talk, polite and measured, but beneath it, the rhythm of the house pulsed in subtle patterns. Lights dimmed, shadows shifted, and every creak in the floor seemed louder in the quiet. She laughed at a joke he made, but the sound felt hollow, echoing off the walls as though the house itself was listening. At one point, he leaned back, studying her over the rim of his glass. "You're very perceptive," he said quietly. "I like that." Her heart skipped. Was it a compliment or a warning? She moved to the window, gazing at the city lights far below, and tried to steady her thoughts. Something about the way he watched her, calm yet calculating, made her wonder whether she had been seeing what she wanted, or whether she had ignored what had been there all along. The night deepened, and he excused himself to another room, leaving her alone. The silence of the house pressing around her, and for the first time, she noticed the careful locks on the doors, the way certain windows were tightly shut, the faint hum of security systems she hadn't asked about. Her chest tightened. She realized that her picture of him, the one she had carried from Chicago, had been incomplete. The man smiling at her now was not entirely who he claimed to be. And as she traced her fingers along the smooth glass of the window, she felt a subtle shift in the air, a sense that her perception, the fragile story she had told herself about him, might be far from the truth. Something in this house, in him, was waiting to be revealed. The street outside was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the city itself had pulled back to watch. The house on Winchester Road rose before her like a shadow pressed into the hills, large but strangely distant, its walls stretching higher than she remembered from the photos he had sent. He guided her up the narrow driveway, each step echoing softly against the concrete. The night air smelled faintly of wet stone and something she couldn't name, an unfamiliar scent that made her senses tighten. Inside, the house revealed more of itself than the photos ever could. The ceilings were high, the floors polished to a reflective sheen, and every hallway seemed to funnel her along a predetermined path. There was a rhythm to his movements, precise and unwavering, that made her pulse thrum with subtle tension. He carried her bags with ease, placing each in a corner that seemed both practical and deliberate. "You'll find it comfortable," he said, his tone even, almost soothing. "I like it quiet." Comfortable. Quiet. The words lingered in her mind, not quite warm, not quite safe. She nodded, tracing her eyes along the minimalistic furniture, the perfectly aligned frames on the wall. There was elegance, yes, but it felt curated, rehearsed, a display of control rather than warmth. He moved ahead, unlocking a door at the end of the hallway. "This will be your room," he said. She stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The room was spacious, sparsely furnished, a bed in the center, a desk by the window, and a wardrobe against the far wall. Everything was neatly in place, but the stillness felt heavy, oppressive in the way silence sometimes presses on your chest. "I like to keep things organized," he added, noticing her lingering glance at the locked cabinet near the corner. "Makes life simpler." She forced a smile, but her stomach churned. There was a sense that nothing in this house was accidental. Each detail, from the placement of the furniture to the faint hum of security cameras she hadn't asked about, suggested a careful orchestration she hadn't noticed before. Dinner passed with light conversation, though each topic felt measured, as if rehearsed beforehand. He spoke about the city, the beaches, and local restaurants, but she found herself cataloging the gaps, the subtle hesitations, the almost imperceptible contradictions in his stories. His laughter was controlled, precise, almost too timely. She wanted to trust him, to believe in the man she had imagined, but the house itself seemed to hum a cautionary tune beneath his calm exterior. Later, as she wandered the hallways alone, she noticed small details that unsettled her further. A lock on the kitchen door that she hadn't seen him use. A window slightly ajar, yet barred from opening fully. The echo of her own footsteps seemed louder than necessary, carrying into corners that felt like silent witnesses. She hugged herself, feeling the tension coil tighter with each measured step. He appeared suddenly at the top of the stairs, his silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. "It's late," he said. "You should rest." There was no warmth in his words, only certainty, a quiet dominance that pressed upon her awareness like an invisible weight. She nodded, swallowing hard, and moved toward her room. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every creak in the floor louder than before. It wasn't just the unfamiliar city or the distance from home. It was a knowledge that the house, and perhaps the man, held secrets she could not yet name. Lying in bed that night, she felt the walls pressing inward, the quiet magnifying the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. She realized that comfort, safety, and trust were not guaranteed here, not in a home so controlled, so precise, and so private. Every instinct she had tried to silence now whispered warnings she could no longer ignore. Outside, the wind stirred the trees along the property line, sending shadows flickering across the window. Something was waiting in those shadows, something she could not yet see, but could feel crawling beneath the surface of a quiet house. And in that moment, sleep felt like surrender. The darkness came quickly that evening, sliding to the house in slow, deliberate currents. She tried to read, tried to let the pages distract her, but her thoughts kept returning to him, the man she had traveled across continents to meet. The apartment felt smaller in the dark, the shadows of the furniture stretching into corners she hadn't noticed before. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the faint creak of floorboards, the wind brushing against the outer walls, seemed amplified, echoing like unspoken warnings. He hadn't returned yet. She told herself it was nothing, that he was just busy in another part of the house. But a quiet unease settled over her chest, pressing down as if the walls themselves were leaning closer. She remembered the way he had looked at her during dinner, a gaze that had lingered just a fraction too long, weighing her reactions, studying the way she moved. A soft knock at the door startled her. "It's open," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her racing heartbeat. But the knock had stopped, leaving only silence. Her fingers brushed against the doorknob, cold, unyielding. She checked the lock, then the window, the security chain, everything she could think of, Everything was as it should be. Yet, the feeling of exposure did not leave. When he returned, it was quiet, almost imperceptible. He didn't announce himself. She sensed him first, the subtle shift in the air, the presence behind her. He moved closer, not aggressively, not threateningly, but with intensity that pressed against her senses. "You're awake," he said softly. "Yes," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Her throat felt dry, and her fingers clenched the blanket. "I thought I'd let you settle in before coming to check," he added, his tone casual but the weight behind it unmistakable. She nodded again, not trusting herself to speak further. The room seemed smaller, the walls closer, the bed heavier under her own weight. Every instinct whispered caution. Yet she felt unable to move, unable to demand the boundaries she had carried across continents. He leaned against the doorway, watching her, and she realized that for all his calm words, he was reading her reactions like an open page. The thought should have terrified her more than it did, but instead it stirred a strange, conflicted curiosity. How much of this man was a persona he had built online, and how much was a reality, raw and unfiltered? Staring back at her in the dark, the hours passed slowly. She lay on her side, hugging the blanket, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing as he moved about in other parts of the house. Each footstep, each shift of weight on the floor made her pulse quicken. Her mind mapped out escape routes, rehearsed questions, potential distractions. The vulnerability of being alone in a house, so controlled, so foreign, gnawed at her. At one point, she thought she heard the soft click of a door she hadn't noticed before. She froze, holding her breath, imagining every possible scenario. Then the sound faded. She exhaled, shaking, but the image lingered. The idea that the house held secrets, that the man she trusted might not be entirely who he claimed to be. Hours later, sleep came in fits, shallow and fragmented. When she woke, the room was empty. He had left without a word, leaving only a faint scent of cologne and the impression of his presence lingering in every corner. She felt the weight of the night pressing on her shoulders. She had survived it, yes, but the memory of being so unprotected, so exposed, would not leave her. And as she glanced toward the locked cabinet in the corner, the feeling came again, an unmistakable certainty that whatever she had glimpsed of him tonight was only the beginning. Something within him had surfaced, something she could not yet understand. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and whispered into the dark, "What are you hiding?" The walls remained silent. Morning came with a pale light that barely penetrated the thick curtains of her room. She felt restless, the shadows of the previous night lingering like echoes along the walls. He was already up, moving quietly through the house, and she could hear the soft scrape of a chair, the clink of a mug against the counter. Her stomach knotted as she tried to piece together the fragments of unease she had carried from the night before. She stepped into the kitchen, trying to mask her tension with a tentative smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice catching slightly. "Morning," he replied, offering her a cup of coffee. His tone was casual, familiar, yet the weight behind his calmness pressed on her more than any words could. He placed a mug before her and leaned against the counter, watching her, measuring her reactions with a subtle precision that set her nerves alight. They spoke about small things, the weather, the city, the distance she had traveled. But in his casual remarks, she caught tiny contradictions, subtle slips that didn't align with the age he had claimed. He mentioned films she knew had been released decades before someone born 25 years ago would have even known them. He referred to past events with an ease and authority that made her pause. She tried to brush it off, but her intuition whispered that something was amiss. "Do you want to see the city today?" he asked, his voice smooth but deliberate. "I'd love that," she replied, keeping her tone light. She wanted to appear confident, to ignore the subtle alarms her mind kept raising. As he spoke, he laughed at something she didn't hear. She noticed a small line at the corner of his eyes, a flicker that betrayed more than he said. Her pulse quickened. She began mentally cataloging every detail she had noticed since her arrival. The controlled movements, the house, the subtle inconsistencies, the way he carried himself with an authority she hadn't expected. She paused, stirred her coffee, and asked lightly, "So, you really are 25? He froze for a fraction of a second, long enough for her instincts to catch fire. Then he smiled, brushing it off with a casual laugh. Of course. That's what I told you, isn't it? But something about the flicker in his eyes, the way his hands tightened slightly on the counter, betrayed the truth he was hiding. She pressed on, curiosity tinged with growing unease. Just checking, sometimes it's hard to imagine. He chuckled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. You think I'm older? He said, teasing lightly. I promise, you'll see, I'm exactly what I said I was. The reassurance rang hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that he had misled her in ways she couldn't yet articulate. Every instinct she had tried to silence was now screaming, echoing against the walls of the house, against the weight of the night before. Later, while he stepped into another room briefly, she examined the small details around her. Photographs on the walls, books on the shelves, small certificates, and letters tucked into corners. She noticed dates that didn't align with his claims. She noticed subtle evidence of life experiences far beyond what a 25-year-old could have lived. Her chest tightened. The truth, she realized, was beginning to surface. She had imagined one man, a soft-spoken young companion. Instead, she was face-to-face with someone older, more controlled, more deliberate, a man who had carefully constructed a persona to capture her trust. Her mind raced as she considered the implications. How much had he hidden? What else was fabricated? The house, the quiet, the careful rhythm of his movements. It all made sense now in a new light, dark and deliberate. When he returned, carrying her suitcase to the hallway, she forced herself to smile. Thank you. His eyes lingered a moment too long. There was a subtle tension in the air, unspoken, as if he sensed that she had started to see through him. And in that glance, she understood nothing he had said was entirely what it seemed. The morning air was sharper than she expected, crisp with the faint tang of the ocean, but it did little to calm her restless thoughts. She had spent the previous night awake, listening to the faint creaks of the house, replaying the inconsistencies in his stories, the subtle cracks in the persona he had built so carefully. Something inside her demanded clarity, demanded reassurance beyond the carefully constructed walls and rehearsed words. She found herself walking toward a small cafe she had noticed on the way to the house, a modest place tucked between buildings with windows fogged from the warmth inside. She told herself she just wanted coffee, a quiet moment, but the need to speak to someone, to share even a fragment of her unease, pulled her across the street. Inside, the cafe hummed with quiet conversation, the clatter of cups and silverware creating a rhythm that felt ordinary, grounding. She settled at a corner table, watching the barista move with casual ease, and tried to steady her thoughts. It was then that she noticed another woman, sitting alone near the window, reading a notebook. There was something familiar in her posture, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes scanned the room with cautious curiosity. She hesitated. Strangers in a foreign city didn't usually warrant attention, yet an impulse urged her forward. "Excuse me," she said softly, drawing the woman's gaze. "Do you know this area well?" The woman looked at her carefully, eyes narrowing just slightly, as if weighing her words. "Somewhat," she replied. "Why do you ask?" I'm new here. Visiting," she said, uncertain how much to reveal. Her voice caught slightly, betraying more than she intended. The woman studied her, then gestured toward the empty seat across the table. "Sit," she said simply. "You look like you could use a friend, or at least someone who's seen strange things before." She hesitated, but took the seat, noticing the way the woman's gaze was both calm and knowing, a strange combination that made her chest loosen slightly. I'm not sure how to explain it," she murmured. "It's personal, but I feel unsafe. Even though nothing has happened, I feel like I'm constantly on edge." The woman's expression softened, the tension in her shoulders easing. "That feeling is real," she said. "It's not imagination. Sometimes danger isn't loud. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes the people you trust the most carry shadows you can't see." Her words struck deeper than she expected. She realized she had been denying the unease, dismissing her instincts as paranoia. But hearing it spoken aloud gave her validation, and for the first time, the thought of seeking help didn't feel shameful. The woman asked a few gentle questions, listening carefully as she spoke, her voice steady, patient. They spoke of trust, of subtle warning signs, of instinct and intuition. Every answer confirmed her growing suspicion that he was not who he had claimed to be, that the careful control, the rehearsed words, the hidden details were all part of a design she hadn't fully understood yet. Later, as she left the cafe, she felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that someone had acknowledged the reality she had felt alone in. Fear that the acknowledgement made the truth undeniable. She was entangled in a web that extended far beyond what she had imagined. Back at the house, he met her at the door, his presence calm but calculated. She noticed a subtle shift in his demeanor, the faint tension behind his eyes, as if he sensed that she had started to see cracks in the carefully constructed illusion. "Back so soon?" he asked lightly. "Just needed some fresh air," she replied, forcing a casual smile. Her fingers still clutched her bag strap tighter than necessary. He nodded, observing her with the same quiet intensity she had grown used to, yet something in his posture hinted at unease, subtle but unmistakable. She realized at the moment she began seeking help, a new layer of tension had emerged, and in that moment, she understood the delicate balance of control in the house had shifted. He might have orchestrated everything, but now, unseen threads were unraveling. Someone else had witnessed part of the shadow he tried to hide. The house fell into a hush as evening approached, the kind of quiet that made every sound sharper, more deliberate. She noticed at first as a subtle shift in the atmosphere, the way the air seemed heavier, how the shadows deepened along the hallway walls. He had retreated into the locked room at the end of the corridor, shutting the door behind him with a soft but final click. The lock itself seemed to thrum with authority, a quiet warning that whatever occurred inside was beyond her reach. She tried to keep herself occupied, tidying the living area, flipping through a book, but every creak of the floorboards, every faint scrape from the other side of the house, reminded her of his presence. It was not a presence of immediate threat, but a force she could feel pressing against her awareness. She realized with a strange mixture of fear and fascination that this ritual, his nightly retreat into isolation, was not just a habit. It was a performance, a containment, and a subtle way of asserting control over the house, over her, over the rhythm of life within these walls. From her vantage in the living area, she could hear the faint sounds of movement, a low shuffle of bare feet, whispered murmurs she could barely decipher, a pattern of noises repeated night after night. Each sound carried a weight, a sense of intent. She strained to make sense of it, to catch a clue, but it remained just out of reach. The house seemed to hold its breath along with her, listening as if it were part of the ritual itself. Sometimes, she swore she caught fragments of words, snippets of confessions, rehearsed phrases, lines she couldn't piece together. She wondered if he was speaking to himself, or if the room contained a witness she could not see. She felt the tension coil tighter in her chest. This was a man who thrived in the shadows, whose strength manifested not only physically but psychologically, shaping the space around him to his own measure. She tried not to let her fears show, but even the faintest tremor in her hands felt like a betrayal. She kept moving through the house, pretending to tidy, to read, to cook, but her thoughts kept returning to the locked room. She felt unprotected, aware that every creak of the floor or distant shuffle was a reminder that she was only partially in control. She was a visitor in a world orchestrated by someone whose mind she was only beginning to glimpse. That night, she lingered in the kitchen, staring at the shadows stretching across the tiled floor. She thought of the cafe, of the woman who had acknowledged the unease she had tried to deny, and felt a faint flicker of relief, but it was fleeting. The house had already begun to imprint itself on her instincts, and she felt its presence in every corner, every subtle hum, every creak. Hours passed. The faint sound of movement in the locked room became rhythmic, almost meditative. He was performing his ritual, and she was a silent observer, caught in the gravity of it. She realized that in these hours, he was both absent and omnipresent, shaping her perception as much as the physical space itself. Her unease was no longer just instinct. It was knowledge, the realization that control here was carefully distributed, measured, and monitored. At one point, a soft, Muffled noise made her freeze. A thud, then a whispered phrase she couldn't comprehend. Her heart leapt, and she pressed herself against the counter, watching the hallway, imagining every scenario that could explain the sound. For the first time, she felt the fragility of her position. She was alone, far from help, completely dependent on the walls, the locks, the rhythm of his ritual to maintain her safety. The night deepened, shadows lengthening as the moonlight filtered through the curtains. The house was alive with the quiet intensity of his unseen actions. She could feel the power of the room, the weight of the ritual, pressing outward, touching every corner, every step she took. And in the silence, she understood fully. The ritual was not just his, but hers too, whether she wanted it or not. The danger, subtle and patient, had already begun to surround her. Something in that room, in him, was waiting to spill beyond the lock. The house felt heavier than ever that night, as if the shadows had grown teeth. She lay awake, tracing the faint outline of the curtains against the dim moonlight, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of floorboards. The locked room at the end of the hall was once again alive with his ritual, the faint shuffle of feet and whispered murmurs carrying across the walls, filling the house with tension. Every sound pressed against her awareness, reminding her that she was alone yet not alone, a witness to a private performance she could not escape. Hours passed in a suspended state of unease, until a sudden shift shattered the rhythm of the night. She heard him move toward the hallway, the soft click of his shoes on the polished floor louder than it should have been. Her body stiffened, heart pounding, every instinct screaming that something was about to change. He stopped just outside her room, his presence brushing against the door in a silent pause that felt like eternity. "You're still awake," he said softly, almost a whisper, yet there was a tremor in his voice she hadn't heard before. "Yes," she replied, keeping her tone steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. "I couldn't sleep." There was a long pause. She felt him leaning against the doorway, his eyes catching the dim light, unreadable. For the first time, the barrier of his calm, rehearsed demeanor seemed to crack. His voice, when it came, was quieter, almost vulnerable. I need to speak," he said. She swallowed hard, unsure whether to feel relief or alarm. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He shifted, pacing slightly, the floorboard soft beneath his weight, yet the intensity of his gaze never wavered. "About everything," he said. "About who I am, what I've done, and what I hide." Her pulse quickened. She had suspected the inconsistencies, the age, the careful control, but now he was opening a door she hadn't expected him to touch. She stayed quiet, forcing herself to remain still, letting the tension mount as he continued. "I wanted you to believe in me," he murmured. "I wanted you to see the man I said I was. Because the man I am is not someone anyone could understand, not someone anyone could accept." His words carved through the night like ice, leaving her chest tight with a mixture of fear and pity. He had carefully curated every detail of his persona, every story, every gesture, and now the carefully built walls were crumbling. She realized in that moment that the danger wasn't only in the world outside. He was unraveling, and she was standing in the middle of it. He stepped closer, voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I've lived a life I can't undo. I've lied, manipulated, all to protect myself, to control what I cannot control." Her fingers clutched the blanket tighter, instinct telling her to retreat, but her body stayed rooted, listening, absorbing the first genuine confession he had allowed himself to utter. There was no aggression in him now, only raw, unfiltered truth, and it was terrifying in its intimacy. "I don't want to hurt anyone," he said, voice breaking slightly. "But I can't stop myself from reliving, from replaying the things I've done, the secrets I've kept." She wanted to ask questions, to demand clarity, but no words came. All she could do was watch as his mask slipped, piece by piece, revealing the cracks she had sensed all along. Then, in a whisper almost lost in the dark, he said, "And soon you'll understand everything, but it may be too late." The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against her lungs, the weight of his confession settling like a stone. She realized that nothing about this night would be ordinary, that the man she believed she knew was dissolving into something far more complex, far more dangerous. yet inwardly destructive. And in that moment, the first real shadow of fear took root deep inside her. The truth was coming, and she could not stop it. The morning began like any other, the sun spilling pale light across the floorboards, brushing over the carefully arranged furniture. Yet something felt different. The usual rhythm of the house, the quiet shuffle from the locked room, the measured steps along the hall, the subtle hum of controlled movement, was missing. The absence pressed on her like a physical weight, making her heart skip in warning. She waited, listening, hoping the sound would return, yet the house remained unervingly still. She stepped into the hallway, every footfall echoing unnaturally, aware now of the fragility of silence in a space that had once been orchestrated around a single person. The door at the end of the corridor was closed, the lock in place, but there was no shuffle, no murmur, no presence pressing against her awareness. She pressed her hand against the doorknob, feeling the chill of metal beneath her fingers. It felt final. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice carrying into the emptiness. Only silence responded, stretching longer than she expected, vibrating with tension. A flicker of dread rose in her chest. Something was wrong. She walked toward the room, careful to keep her movement steady, trying to suppress the rising panic. The faint scent of cologne lingered, but it was muted, like a ghost of the life that had existed there yesterday. She pushed the door open and froze. The room was empty. Not empty in the way she had imagined. A chair overturned, paper scattered, but clinically, deliberately vacant. The bed was made, the floor spotless, every item in its place. Yet the air was heavy with absence, oppressive in the way it pressed against her chest. Something had shifted beyond her understanding. An instinct screamed that the shift was irreversible. She called his name again, louder, trembling, but the sound was swallowed by the walls. Her mind raced, retracing the events of the past days. The careful control, the inconsistencies, the rituals, the locked room, the cracks of persona, the confessions at night. Her heart hammered against her ribs as fragments of suspicion now solidified into chilling clarity. Finally, she noticed it, a note tucked under the edge of the bed. Her fingers shook as she picked it up, written in neat, deliberate handwriting with a word she had feared and anticipated. A confession of sorts, acknowledging the manipulation, the deception, the hidden truths. He had admitted the lies, the false age, the control, even the private acts he had conducted within that room. Her chest tightened as the gravity of the note settled around her. She read and reread the lines, feeling both relief and horror in the acknowledgement. The truth she had sensed, pieced together from subtle hints and instincts, had finally surfaced. Yet it was too late. The quiet was not merely absence, it was finality. She sank into the nearest chair, gripping the note, trying to steady her breath. Questions rose unbidden. Had he planned this all along? Was the quiet intentional, a final act of control? She could feel the weight of all the previous nights pressing into her mind, a chain of unease now culminating in certainty. Then came the sound, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a faint click on the lock, a whisper of movement outside the room. Her head snapped up, and she held her breath, straining to see beyond the doorway. But nothing emerged, nothing moved. Only the shadows remained, flickering across the walls as if alive, as if keeping secrets she could not yet grasp. Her thoughts circled relentlessly. The confessions, the rituals, the locked room, the contradictions in his stories. They all pointed to a life carefully hidden, and now that life had ended, leaving only echoes of control and secrecy behind. Yet she sensed there was more to discover, more that the silence had yet to reveal. She slid the note into her pocket, moving cautiously toward the living area. The house was still, but she could feel the lingering tension, the residue of what had happened, pressing against her awareness. She realized that the story had only just begun to unravel, and that the investigation, the exposure of secrets, and the reckoning of his deeds were inevitable. And in that sudden quiet, she understood fully. The man she thought she knew had disappeared, leaving behind a carefully constructed void, and the first glimpses of the truth had begun to surface. The morning air was sharp with the scent of salt from the nearby coast as the investigators arrived. The house on Winchester Road, so carefully curated and silently oppressive, now felt exposed, stripped of its illusions. She stood aside, clutching her coat, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the carefully maintained world she had entered was about to be dissected piece by piece. The movers had arrived first, tasked with removing his body. As they gently shifted the furniture in the locked room, a subtle sound drew the attention of one of the investigators. A soft click, followed by the faint hiss of a hidden mechanism. A panel beneath the wardrobe, previously unnoticed, slid open to reveal a small compartment filled with neatly stacked folders, envelopes, and a collection of electronic devices. Her stomach tightened. She had suspected deception, inconsistencies, but nothing prepared her for the tangible proof of his hidden life. Investigators began sorting through the contents carefully, pulling out documents that detailed his real age, far older than the man he had claimed to be. Other papers outlined previous relationships, meticulously chronicled, showing patterns of manipulation and secrecy. Each folder contained a mixture of contracts, letters, and photographs, some mundane, others deeply unsettling in their implication. Digital devices were examined next. Laptops, hard drive, and USB sticks revealed an extensive online presence. Personas crafted to mislead, entice, and control. Every interaction she had experienced, every carefully chosen phrase and photograph, now fit into a pattern of deliberate falsification. He had created identities across platforms, each with a distinct story, different ages, professions, even locations. Each lie was designed to sustain a version of himself that the world, and she, would believe. Financial records revealed manipulation on another level. Accounts had been opened under various names, transactions traced to accounts she couldn't comprehend, and purchases that hinted at a life built on control and secrecy. It was a web far more intricate than she could have imagined, connecting him to people she would never meet, places she had never seen. She watched silently as the investigators uncovered emails, some benign, others alarming. There were messages hinting at obsessions, emotional dependency, and carefully planned interactions with unsuspecting individuals. The man she had traveled to meet was both a stranger and a carefully curated fiction, more a projection than a person, a life designed to ensnare those who trusted him. Her hands shook as she picked up a folder containing his personal journal. The pages were filled with reflections that alternated between remorse, planning, and disturbing attempts to justify his actions. He had chronicled his inner thoughts in obsessive detail, revealing psychological instability and a compulsive need for control. Each line, each entry, made her realize just how carefully she had been drawn into his orbit. Despite the shock, a small sense of relief washed over her. The uncertainty, the doubts, the creeping unease that had haunted her since the first night, now had context, validation, and clarity. She was not imagining the cracks, the manipulations, the inconsistencies. They were real. But relief was fleeting, replaced quickly by a deeper, heavier sense of devastation. She mourned the loss of trust, of innocence, of the possibility of a genuine connection. The investigators began cataloging everything meticulously, photographing, documenting, and sealing items for evidence. She followed quietly, absorbing each revelation, each document, each message, understanding that the story had only fully begun now that the truth had been pulled into the light. Finally, an investigator held up a document, and her breath caught. It was a certificate, official, with his real date of birth and legal name. The truth could no longer be denied. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing against her chest. The man she had met, the careful facades, the nights of control and rituals, the confessions in the dark, they were all shadows of a person who had hidden himself behind layers of deceit. And in that moment, she realized the magnitude of the situation, the full extent of manipulation, the breadth of his secrets, the depth of his instability. Everything had finally been exposed. The house, once an instrument of control, now stood as a silent witness to the unraveling of a carefully constructed life. The courtroom was cold, sterile, and intimidating, yet it pulsed with anticipation. She sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly, staring at the empty seat that had once been occupied by him. The reality of his absence was stark. The man who had orchestrated her journey, manipulated her trust, and hidden his true self behind layers of calculated deception would never face her gaze again. And yet, the trial that had been convened was not for him, but for the shadows he left behind, the lies, the manipulations, the cascading consequences of a life hidden in plain sight. The prosecutor approached the bench, documents in hand, speaking with measured authority. Each exhibit detailed his web of deceit, his real age, the falsified identities, digital correspondences, and financial manipulations. Witnesses were called, individuals who had interacted with his false personas, each recounting similar experiences of betrayal, confusion, and emotional entanglement. Her chest tightened as she listened. Every word echoed her own experiences, validating instincts she had once questioned. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "we are dealing with a life constructed to manipulate, to deceive, and to control." While the defendant is deceased, the evidence shows a consistent pattern of calculated actions intended to harm and ensnare unsuspecting individuals. The defense spoke briefly, acknowledging the deceased struggles with psychological instability, but it was clear that the truth would weigh heavier than sentiment. The judge's gavel fell with finality several times, punctuating the proceedings with a rhythm that mirrored her own heartbeat. She felt simultaneously vindicated and haunted. Justice was being sought, even if the person responsible could not answer for himself. She recounted her experiences under oath, describing the initial excitement, the journey, the subtle manipulations, the rituals, and the eventual revelations of his true identity. Her voice trembled at times, but she maintained clarity, each sentence a thread weaving together the truth that had been carefully hidden for so long. She noticed the jury's expressions, the quiet nods of acknowledgement, the weight of comprehension settling over the room. The trial unfolded methodically. Digital evidence was presented on large screens, emails, chats, videos, and photographs that demonstrated the deliberate construction of multiple personas. Investigators testified to psychological analysis, describing compulsive behavior, patterns of control, and the methods he had used to isolate, manipulate, and coerce individuals into believing the carefully crafted illusion of a man younger, softer, and more trustworthy than he truly was. At one point, she caught a fleeting glance at the defense attorney, eyes narrowing slightly. There was a subtle recognition that the courtroom, the evidence, and the witnesses had stripped away the layers of misdirection he had built. For the first time, the power he once held over perception was gone. Outside the courtroom, whispers of the revelation spread rapidly. Friends and family of other victims spoke quietly, sharing stories that confirmed the patterns she had observed. The collective testimony painted a portrait of a man who had lived in the shadows, whose control over appearances had created a ripple of deception that reached far beyond her own experience. As the closing statements were made, she felt an unusual mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth had been acknowledged, sorrow for the realization of how deeply the web had reached and how many others had unknowingly been ensnared. The judge summarized the findings, recognizing the deliberate deception, the psychological manipulation, and the consequences of his actions. While he could not be sentenced in the traditional sense, the formal record of truth stood as a testament to the severity of his deeds. Finally, the courtroom emptied, leaving her standing near the bench, absorbing the finality. Yet even in closure, a subtle unease lingered. The layers of manipulation, the carefully orchestrated life, and the psychological control he had exercised left her with an indelible impression. Shadows of his presence would linger, even as the court declared the truth, and she realized with quiet clarity that while justice had been recognized, perception, the delicate, fragile way humans trust and understand, was a realm he had mastered, and she would carry the memory of that mastery far beyond the courtroom walls. The days after the trial were strangely quiet, yet the silence carried weight. She returned to her small apartment in Cape Town, each room a sanctuary from the echoes of Winchester Road, yet unable to fully escape the memories etched in her mind. The trial had confirmed the truth, revealed the hidden manipulations, and exposed the carefully constructed life he had left behind. And yet, the emotional residue lingered, a mixture of relief, grief, and lingering unease. She often found herself replaying moments from the house, the locked room, the subtle inconsistencies, the whispers in the night, the confessions he had forced from himself in fragments. They were no longer haunting illusions, but pieces of a narrative now validated in court. Yet validation did not erase the vulnerability she had felt, the night spent feeling unprotected, the emotional toll of realizing how easily trust had been exploited. The media coverage had been relentless. Articles described the psychological intricacies, the deceptive identities, and the consequences of a life lived in secrecy. Experts spoke of manipulation, control, and the dangers of carefully curated personas online. While the reports brought clarity to outsiders, for her, they were both comforting and exhausting. A reminder that the world had finally acknowledged the truth, but the scars were hers to carry. Friends and family reached out, offering support, listening to fragmented recounts of her journey. She discovered strength in their presence, a validation that the fear she had felt, the unease she had ignored, had been real. Each conversation became a subtle act of reclaiming autonomy, of asserting that the experience had not defined her, that she could step forward without being bound by the shadows of his life. She also felt the weight of justice, not as vengeance, but as acknowledgement. The court record, the evidence, the testimonies, all created a permanent narrative that honored the truth and condemned the deceit. While he had taken his own life before facing full accountability, the uncovering of secrets and the formal acknowledgement of his manipulations ensured that the consequences of his actions were recognized beyond his absence. Weeks passed, and she began to rebuild routines. Quiet mornings with coffee, walks along the coast, the distant hum of the city offering a rhythm she could anchor herself to. She took solace in small details. The first cup of coffee without fear, the ease of conversation without calculation, the sunlight filtering through her window without hidden intent. Each ordinary moment was a reclamation of agency, a subtle form of healing. Yet she did not forget. The memories of manipulation, of being deceived, of the moments she had felt unprotected, remained like faint shadows at the edge of her awareness. They were reminders, not chains, a quiet testament to lessons learned, instincts honed, and resilience forged in the crucible of experience. The house on Winchester Road was empty now, stripped of his presence but heavy with the residual tension of his life. Investigators had sealed documents, evidence had been archived, and the world had cataloged his story as a cautionary tale. For her, the reckoning was not merely legal. It was personal, an internal acknowledgement of vulnerability, courage, and the reclamation of trust in herself. In the end, the shadows he cast were no longer instruments of fear, but markers of insight. She understood now that human perception, trust, and intuition were powerful, delicate forces that could be manipulated but not erased. She had survived the ordeal, seen the truth, and emerged with the clarity to navigate the world with vigilance, empathy, and quiet strength. Standing at the edge of the coast one evening, the wind carrying the scent of the ocean and the fading warmth of the sun on her skin, she breathed deeply. She had journeyed through deception, danger, and revelation, and now she could move forward. The past would remain, but it would not define her. The reckoning was complete, not through vengeance, but through truth, resilience, and the quiet reclamation of her own life. The shadows were behind her, and for the first time in months, she could feel the light.